Welcome to a particularly wet edition of Rollin' Rambles. I'm your host, Jody Bruchon, which is not the way my name is pronounced, but I thought it would be funny. I run around the internet and I try to convince people not to use Google Chrome, but the problem is not using Google Chrome also means not using Edge or Brave or a whole host of other browsers. It basically has become this hydra. There are 1,000 heads of Chrome, and they all have different names, but at the core lies Chromium. Chromium is the open source core of Google Chrome, upon which a ton of other browsers and even entire applications are built. The problem with Chromium is that it is becoming Internet Explorer. Now, obviously, that's more of an analogy than an actual statement of fact. But Chromium is definitely becoming what Internet Explorer was back in the day. Internet Explorer used to be a monoculture, and you would all do well to learn about it if you don't already know about it. See, I came from the 90s. The late 90s ish, I learned how to make my own web pages in HTML, and CSS was not a thing yet. Let me be clear. HTML4, CSS didn't really exist, or if it did exist, I didn't know about it, or whatever. Maybe it did exist and I just don't remember. But one way or the other, CSS was not one of those things that you really had to use to make a web page. You would embed your styles in with the actual content. You'd use HTML tags to style your text. Now, obviously, HTML originally was not supposed to be a presentation language. It's supposed to define the text, but it's not supposed to be like, oh, the whole thing it is just to make things bold or whatever. Maybe I'm thinking of its predecessor, SGML or whatever. Anyway, those details really don't matter all that much. What does matter is that back in the day, Internet Explorer was a plague. It was a scourge. It was the thing that everybody hated, but nobody could avoid. If you used a Mac back in the late 90s, Internet Explorer was probably the bane of your existence, because even though there was an Internet Explorer for Mac back then, what you could not do is run ActiveX controls, which were basically programs, but they latched into the browser core and they sat on top of the Windows API to do what they do. I think you can see where this is going. It's kind of difficult to run these Windows API programs on Internet Explorer for Mac. So while it might have used the same render engine, it did not have any of the ActiveX controls that all these web pages would expect you to have. Now, to be fair, 80% of the internet that required an ActiveX control required Macromedia Flash Player. That was the ActiveX control that a lot of web pages used back then, because Flash could do all kinds of dynamic content that HTML simply could not do. But here's the thing. Let me just give you an example. Back in the day, Internet Explorer offered these extensions to the standard, and I used one of them on one of my pages, where if you had Internet Explorer, it had this wave filter. Internet Explorer's dynamic, or DHTML super standard, if you will, let you apply these filters to things on the page. And it was fun, but it was Internet Explorer only. Internet Explorer was notorious for taking all of the web standards, adhering to them somewhat, but then breaking them in several subtle ways. Now, you might be wondering, well, what's the big deal with Internet Explorer? Why are you saying Chrome is becoming Internet Explorer? Back in the day, in the mid-90s, there were actually multiple browsers available, and the one that most people used was a paid product called Netscape. Netscape Navigator was the browser. Netscape Communicator was the Netscape suite, which included a browser and a mail client and a newsreader, all that stuff. Just so we're clear, Netscape eventually, basically, let's just say, went out of business by converting into an open source project and renamed Mozilla, and then they rebuilt the Netscape, then Mozilla suite into Firefox and Thunderbird. So that's your lineage on Netscape. If you're running Firefox, you are running the evolution of Netscape Navigator. But Netscape Navigator was basically the standard for most people. Other browsers existed. Obviously, web browsers existed way before Netscape Navigator. The first one was literally called World Wide Web, but didn't see widespread use because it was quickly surpassed by better browsers that other people created. In fact, Internet Explorer is directly derived from NCSA Mosaic, which was popular in the early days of the World Wide Web because Mosaic was, I mean, if you look at Internet Explorer 1.0, that's Mosaic. It was the same thing. And I've actually downloaded and run it back in the late 90s. I ran NCSA Mosaic just to see what it was like. It's Internet Explorer. It was just Internet Explorer. The Trident engine, they literally pulled, I can't remember the exact details, but they either bought Mosaic or bought the rights to Mosaic, or Mosaic was bought by someone else. I think they were called Spyglass Software. And in one way or another, what ended up happening is NCSA Mosaic ended up becoming Internet Explorer and got integrated into Windows 95. Everyone who got a computer with Windows 95, which means, of course, every new computer sold in 1995, got a copy of Internet Explorer 1.0 for free. Netscape Navigator remained a paid product. So you could pay $30 or $40 or however much it was in the late 90s or whatever for Netscape Communicator or Netscape Navigator or whatever. I don't know the details. I was not exactly old at the time. Or you could use Internet Explorer for free. Now, Windows had, even back then, a virtual monopoly on desktop operating systems. If you had a desktop PC, there was a 90% chance you were running a Windows product, be it 3.1 or 95. Back in 1995, good chance that's what you're running. Yes, Macs existed. Yes, Linux existed for a couple of years. Unix systems were all over the place. But the vast majority of desktops, especially because of consumers, just good old normal consumers, Windows 3.1 or 95, and Internet Explorer was actually backported to Windows 3.1. So if you had Windows 3.1, you could browse the internet with that too. But here we go. Internet Explorer, because it was free and because it was bundled with Windows 95, became the most popular browser practically overnight. In business terms, overnight. Because it was there and it was free. Who's going to go pay $30 for Netscape? Why would you pay $30 for something that came with your computer for free? And so, of course, overnight, instant sensation. But that's not all. Microsoft were actually pretty damn smart. You know, you can think Microsoft in the 90s was evil. You're probably right. But Microsoft in the 90s was really, really smart. Microsoft in the 90s gave away Internet Explorer for free, but they also, rather than making Internet Explorer just some big bulk program that sits on its own in some folder somewhere, in Windows 95, Internet Explorer itself was broken down into components that could be reused by both the operating system and any program that ran on top of the operating system. Ever since Windows 95, Internet Explorer has been a core component of Microsoft Windows. That's right, Internet Explorer is a core part of Windows. Now I want you to think about what that means. That means that you have tons of programs that use Internet Explorer components or even show Windows, various program windows as Internet Explorer embedded web pages or whatever. This meant that Internet Explorer became familiar to programmers as something that not only was a browser in its own right, but also something they could program with and integrate into their software and not have to build their own HTML rendering engine. They could basically, this was sort of the start, believe it or not, all the way back in Windows 95, we saw the start of the web application as the desktop application. Now, obviously it didn't work like that. You still had to have an actual program that ran the Internet Explorer components, assembled them together, and told them, hey, render a browser window here, and load this content here, blah, 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 blah. So it wasn't as simple as just saying, hey, run Internet Explorer with this HTML page and we'll just call it a program. It didn't work like that. But with programmers becoming familiar with Internet Explorer in general, just as a tool, a general purpose tool that was available with the vast majority of consumer PCs, now you could write your software, tightly integrate it with Internet Explorer to save on development time and costs, because it's already there. It's guaranteed to be in Windows 95 and up. Even the European ones that debundled it still had to have the IE components. Just got rid of the browser shortcut and maybe the executable, but all the components were still there. All the IE, HTML, DLL, whatever's, all still there. Now we've set the scene. Internet Explorer was free, effectively destroying Netscape Navigator's business model overnight. Internet Explorer was included with every copy of Windows 95, and you could get it for Windows 3.1 for free just a little bit later. In fact, I think they shipped Internet Explorer all the way up through version 5 for Windows 3.1, if I recall correctly. And for Mac, they had a 5.5 version, I think, that was the last one. But Internet Explorer was everywhere, practically overnight, for free. Zero effort install because it's already there on every consumer PC with Windows 95 and up. So almost overnight, Internet Explorer is everywhere. Programmers are using it like crazy because it saves them a lot of time, And so what do you have? You have this perfect storm. A browser monoculture. Netscape effectively goes out of business because, over the years, now that this thing is out there hogging it all up, Netscape can't compete with free and already there. And that's why some antitrust stuff was filed against Microsoft in the 90s, precisely because of Internet Explorer essentially destroying all competitors overnight by being bundled with Windows. Talk about anti-competitive. How can you compete with free and available? But it got worse because programmers would be like, oh, hey, this is great. I can just tie my program to it. Website makers could be like, oh, hey, well, I already have this, so I'll just use this to prototype my web page. And then when they found out, oh, Netscape, oh, it's not compatible with Netscape, like I'm having trouble with your page on Netscape. Well, bro, why don't you use Internet Explorer? You already have it on your computer. Why don't you use Internet Explorer? That's what I wrote the page for. And I'm not buying a $30 copy of Netscape to test my page against. So why don't you just use it? Oh, okay. Yeah, I do have. Okay, I'll try that. Thanks. Instant death. Instant monoculture. And then, as if this had not been hammered in hard enough, where did Internet Explorer go from there? Remember those programmers that I talked about? How so many of them tied Internet Explorer components in? Guess what? Guess what that was good practice for? ActiveX controls. What's an ActiveX control? It's a Windows program that ties into the browser. There's all kinds of subtle details, but at the end of the day, ActiveX is really just a Windows executable framework, and that's it. So people would develop Windows applications that hooked into Internet Explorer. Their websites would distribute them when they needed to do anything other than the most basic stuff that a web browser could offer. For example, for a long time, and my God, do I mean a long time, over 10 years, if you bought a new, just off-the-shelf camera and DVR security system for your house or your business or whatever, and you wanted to remote view, you would load an embedded web server in that device. You would have to port forward through your NAT router that everybody had by the late 2000s. Everybody's behind NAT routing at that point. You would have to port forward your camera system's embedded web server, which would then send an ActiveX control, which, remember, is a Windows executable. It actually runs natively on your processor, down to your Windows computer to enable it to access the video streams from the camera. Because you know what Internet Explorer couldn't do in the late 90s, early 2000s, even the mid 2000s, late 2000s, you name it, it couldn't receive video like that. Video streaming in the browser has actually not been a thing for a long time. YouTube originally in the mid 2000s when YouTube first sprung up, and even through the late 2000s, they were still using shockwave flash based video. If you watched a YouTube video in 2008, it was being watched in an embedded Macromedia shockwave flash player. Flash on Internet Explorer was an ActiveX control. Flash is also not necessarily ideal for receiving video in real time from a camera security system. So they would basically build their own ActiveX control, their own custom solution that could deal with the codecs the DVR used and so on and so forth. Basically a little custom controller program for every single one of these units that the unit would upload or download. Yeah, it would upload to your client, so to speak, and then have the client run in the browser embedded. But it was really just they were sending the software to manipulate the camera. But guess what? If you're on a Mac, you're screwed. Linux, Unix, any of that, you're screwed. ActiveX controls only work on Windows. It's even worse than that, because an ActiveX control might work on Windows, but it only works on specific Windows. It's still a Windows application. So you could have subtle compatibility problems with your camera DVR's ActiveX control for seeing the video feeds and controlling the cameras. You can have compatibility issues with your Windows operating system if there was some sort of special configuration, or maybe you were running Windows NT instead of Windows 98 or 2000 or whatever. You know, you could run into all these subtle bugs because these are full-blown applications no matter how you cut it. And there are differences between systems that can cause weird things to happen. Nowadays, if you want to deal with video streams, the browser already has stuff embedded in it to handle that. You've got embedded video hard decoders, and you've got support for streaming protocols in the browser, things like WebRTC, real-time communications, all that stuff used to not be in browsers. Browsers used to not be able to do any of that. And now they can, which makes it a lot easier to write something that can manage a camera system remotely, because now instead of writing your own custom ActiveX control, all you have to do is set up basically a REST API and have your client, log in, get a cookie, and send commands to the thing, and have the thing send back video streams to your browser. And none of it requires special extra software, because the browser has gotten so complicated nowadays, in large part because it contains these extra features now that didn't exist back then. But herein, again, lies the problem, and let's bring it all full circle. Back in the day, if you did not run Internet Explorer on Windows, you were effectively cut off from 20% or more of the internet, and from the vast majority of corporate websites, which they absolutely refused to make work with anything else. There was an auto dealership in my town where I've been doing all this computer stuff, for the past 14 whatever years. I don't remember anymore. My math, not brain right, the dumb today. But over a decade and a half. I've been doing computer support for this dealership, car dealership, Ford dealership, right? And Ford Motor Company required Internet Explorer. If you loaded the pages for all the back-end stuff for the dealership in Firefox or even Chrome, it wouldn't work. It just wouldn't work. And it was only a few years ago that they fixed all that because Internet Explorer was deprecated and being rigged to not work normally in Windows anymore. Microsoft bailed on Internet Explorer, so they had no choice but to stop shoving ActiveX controls and Internet Explorer only pages down your throat, and they had to switch to forcing Google Chrome down your throat instead, which is what they do now. So, now we have a situation where Firefox doesn't work with this corporate website. That sounds an awful lot like the bad old days of Internet Explorer. Because keep in mind, now every modern browser is such a complicated piece of software because it contains all of these features that are required by all of these crazy websites that had all of these disparate requirements that needed webcam access and video decoding and real-time voice communications and audio streaming and all this other nutty stuff. And now the browser has it. At least in the days of Internet Explorer, you could argue, well, without ActiveX, without this ability to shove a program down the browser's throat, we just wouldn't be able to do it at all. Or we'd have to write a custom client they would have to download and install ahead of time instead of the browser doing it for them. And then we'd have to write a custom server that would talk to the custom client, and the custom client probably wouldn't be as good, blah, 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 blah. So at least back in the day, you could make the argument that without ActiveX, maybe we wouldn't have gotten the nice things at all, or maybe the things would have been a whole lot nastier to deal with. That argument is for another year, because it doesn't matter anymore. But today, there's no excuse. There's no excuse for not supporting Firefox and Safari, in addition to Google Chrome, and more importantly, the Chromium core of Google Chrome, that is the core of Edge and Vivaldi and Brave and probably your browser of choice if it doesn't end with the word Fox or Weasel for some reason. There's no excuse for not supporting it, and yet that's what they do. And I understand that it's a lot easier to standardize on one browser so that you don't have to deal with little implementation-specific details when you do support for customers. I get that, but there's no excuse. Frankly, that's laziness on your part as a company. I wouldn't want to do business with a company that's that lazy, that thinks it's so important to cut that tiny little bit of probably not even really, they're probably already paying the people, so it's probably not even a cost measure at all. But if they're going to cut that hard, I don't know that I want to do business with them. And yet, here we are. The problem is, it's not just one company. A lot of people do this. A lot of people do it, and when they do, what are you going to do? You know, if you have to access your bank and your bank doesn't support Firefox, they're like, we only support Google Chrome and Chrome-based browsers, or even just Google Chrome is usually what it ends up being. Then what are you going to do? If you need to go check your balances or do a transfer or whatever, you have to use Chrome or a Chromium-based browser to do it, because otherwise you just don't get to do it. They don't care. Why do they care? What are you going to do? Close your accounts? You going to close your accounts and go somewhere else over Firefox? Huh? Are you? I mean, maybe you should, and you should let them know why. But that's the problem, is nobody's going to do that. They're just going to do whatever thing. People are used to being abused and, being bullied into doing things that they don't necessarily want to do or that aren't the best for them. And there you go. And that's how Chromium becomes the next Internet Explorer. The worst part of it all being that there's no reason for it to be that way. Because browsers can do basically everything now, and ActiveX controls are long dead thing of the past. Flash is long dead. We've got HTML5 and Canvas and all that crap. We don't need any of that old stuff. And yet, somehow, we are still standardizing on Chromium as the internet, the web, Chromium is the way. It's the browser. If you're using Edge, you're using Chromium. If you're using Brave and you think you're smart, oh, Google can't manifest v3 my ass because I've got Brave. I'm so smart. But you're still using Chromium, you moron. You're still using the browser core that is becoming a monoculture on the internet. And yes, I am aware that Brave is not going to let Manifest v3 leak into Brave. But the problem is, as these things diverge, they require effort by experienced programmers that are actively working on these things to keep them afloat. So what are you going to do? I mean, you've got all these programmers with these forks. They get stretched thin. Do you know why Microsoft Edge is Chromium? Because it wasn't always that way. Originally, Edge was a new browser engine written from scratch called Edge HTML. It was Microsoft's replacement for Internet Explorer. The goal was to make a whole new browser engine that ditched all Internet Explorer's problems, that maintained feature parity with Chrome, but where it could be shared so that Electron applications, Electron is a framework that pairs a Google Chromium browser and I think a Node.js server together, and they call that and it's a web application turned native desktop application, but it's really a web browser and web server tied together. The idea was that Edge HTML, being embedded into Windows 8 and above, would allow universal Windows platform apps, you know, not programs, not applications, not software, but apps like their appetizers, to be able to share browser cores and servers in the Electron framework, so you could write all these new native apps and they would run better on Windows 8 and above because the Electron framework was provided by Windows and shared heavily amongst each other, so that if you're running 10 Electron apps, you know, like Slack and Skype and I think Discord are all really just running on Chromium, but those cores would all be shared. They would no longer be a whole separate instance of a slightly different version of the framework, taking up yet another whole browser core and RAM. Now the cores would be shared so that less resources would be used, so switching between things would be faster, caches would get blown out less quickly, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, do you know why Edge HTML was abandoned in favor of making a new goofy wave-looking icon, calling it New Edge or whatever, and then just swapping it out for Chromium? Because, in the words of Microsoft, and I'll never forget this because it was a sentence I just never thought I would read, it was clearly too difficult to maintain feature parity with Chrome, so they abandoned Edge. So people got their hopes up with Edge as the replacement for Internet Explorer, and it ended up becoming Chrome anyway, because Chrome changed so rapidly, and because keeping up with Chrome was so difficult, that billion-dollar multinational monopolistic bastard evil corporation Microsoft gave up and had to use Google's Chromium instead of Edge HTML. Microsoft threw away an entire years-long project in favor of just using Google's code. That's the power of a monoculture. Microsoft got Internet Explored by Google. When you use a Chromium browser, when you use an Electron application, you are contributing to the Chromium monoculture. When you use Chrome or Brave or an application on a phone that's based on it, you are contributing, however minutely, to a Chromium monoculture. You are contributing to the Internet Explorer-ification of the modern web. And it is extremely difficult, if not impossible, for all of these other browsers and forks and such to keep up with it. If you run a not Chromium browser, or not Google Chrome browser even, you run the risk of not being able to check your bank accounts, not being able to video conference. That's the price that you pay for not being part of the monoculture. And there's no good answer to this problem. I'm not here to offer an answer other than run WaterFox. Why not Firefox? Because they bought an ad company And most of Firefox's donations go towards AI and crypto scam crap instead of actually paying for making the browser better. Plus, they were infested with social justice lunatics 10 years ago. And, you know, Firefox is turbo paused and has ad settings in their settings. They're becoming an ad company. Do you really think that they're going to let uBlock Origin continue working on Firefox all the way into the future when they are now an ad company competing with Google? Yeah, it's not going to happen, dude. If you think so, you're way too optimistic about things. But why WaterFox? Because if you're on Windows, WaterFox is a great fork. That's all I have to say. It performs well. 99% of things work. Every once in a while, you have a Widevine DRM problem if you try to use stupid Netflix or something. But that's about it. But you know what? As long as you're not using Pale Moon, use whatever fork you want. I don't really care. As long as it's not based on Chromium, you're still not contributing to the monoculture. You're still doing the right thing. And, you know, whatever deity you believe in, bless you. I'm going to leave it there. Like, comment, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. Actually, you know what? Screw it. Unsubscribe. Unsubscribe twice, just to be sure. If you see the subscribe thing turn back into a bell again, then you did it right. Take it easy.